Let's see how this goes. Fun times in the city. I don't have any of my audio gear. This probably sounds terrible. Test, test, test. Yeah, it's not so bad. If you've joined me before class here, bear with me while I figure out how to stream from the incredibly crappy environment that we have. Oh boy. Asked a very nice question in the chat there. If you could help me out and tell me if you can actually hear and see me. Sorry, to be clear, you can't see me, but you should be able to hear me. Oh man. Okay, let's get going. Sounds like it's working. To those of you who say it's crap, well, it's comparatively crap. But behold, it's 1080p splendor, and it's like 8-bit rate audio in all its glory. All right, let's go into deceptive pricing. I did not think this through because I have to stare sideways at the screen the whole time while doing this. But hey, whatever. All right. So this is going to be our finale for the deceptive pricing section. And we've talked about a lot of different ways that companies might deceive you on the price up front. But then we also talked a little bit about how there are some costs that are incurred later on. So today we're going to focus on some of the most egregious costs that you can incur after you bought the software. And before that, we're going to get into one of my favorite discussions, which is the discussion of wealth, and especially the discussion of wealth in America. America doesn't knock because freedom rings. Woo! All right. American wealth. Before we start, let's talk about income stats because you're probably familiar with hearing these all the time in political discussions. But those kinds of stats that you tend to hear the most often are the least useful. They're just little joke stats that people use to throw political jabs at one another and score points against their political opponents. One of the funniest ones is household income. Household income is one of those sure signs that you're having a disingenuous discussion because it doesn't make sense. People say, well, it's been stagnant for years. Well, no, it's gone up a bit. It hasn't gone up very quickly. But while the household income hasn't increased very much, actually in all of the West, not just the United States, the average household size dropped in the 70s. It was more than 3 people per household average. In 1985, it was about 2.7 people in a household. Now it's 2.5 people in a household. This should be pretty obvious to you if you know anything about living things. When living things have enough resources, what do? They multiply, and then they go off on their own. So most of you are probably not particularly keen on living with your parents or with roommates for the rest of your life, right? Your household will get smaller eventually. You will move out of your parents' house or you'll leave your roommates. The limiting factor is whether you have enough money, purchasing power. So, of course, the average household income isn't that important. It just matches the average size of the family unit in that era. And then beyond that is a measure of how many people require families where your aunts and uncles and grandparents also live with you and have to work to be able to afford your accommodations and lifestyle, which of course in America very rare. And of course it's gone up a bit. 62,000 in today's money versus 54,000 in 1985. That's not a big increase. But if you divide it by the average size of the household change, then it is a significant increase. And most of the other stats you see are also somewhat wrong in similar ways. They depict something that's not necessarily the entire truth of the matter. So let's start with US income. I don't know why I said U.S. income states, but whatever. Let's look at the average individual income, which is really high, especially if you consider the household one earlier, huh? That's weird. An average wage earner, and I believe this is for a full-time average wage earner, but maybe not. I think this is actually the average for all wage earners, about $63,000. But that doesn't make sense because the 50th percentile only makes 44,000. Well, wages in America are pretty top heavy. The people who make a lot of money make a lot of money. But the 80th percentile is already pretty high, $87,000 at the 80th percentile. So let's do a little challenge in the chat. Why don't you guys pick another country that you think is generally very wealthy or they have a good system of government or whatever? So pick someone you think is like the number two. Let's look at their 50th and 80th percentile wages. Pick any company, put it in the chat that you think is generally prosperous, they have a good system, so on and so forth. And note that as we look these up, that most software developers are going to make the 80th percentile or above. It's going to be definitely something that's software. All right, so we got UK percentile calculator. I have actually looked at this one before. I'm glad you guys picked the UK because I can find one pretty quick. Someone said Amsterdam, which is not a country. That's the Netherlands is the country that you're thinking of. All right. Okay, well, here's one data point. Let's start with this one. All right, so here we can see that, probably not very clearly for you, but you can see that with an income of 80,000 pounds, you'd be in the top 5% of earners. Remember, for the United States, $87,000 only puts you in the top 80th percentile, the top 20%. Here, 80,000 pounds puts you in the top 5% of earners. I'll let you do the conversion. Let's find another one. That's, by the way, your income before tax in all those countries described. Let's say, let's do the 50th percentile. So 44,000 USD to Great British Pounds. That's 32,000 pounds. And keep in mind that their cost of living, as somebody mentioned, is likely higher. Okay, so if you make the 50th percentile in the United States, according to this source, you're in the top 31% of earners, just earning at the 50th percentile in the UK. So let's go and do the conversion for the 80th percentile. That's 87,000 USD to GDP. If someone wants to pull up the cost of living comparison too, that might be interesting. So 87,000 USD is 63,000 Great British Pound. Let's see what that is on the percentile calculator. If you're the 80th percentile in the US, you are top 7% in Great Britain. Top 7% in Great Britain. What is top 7% in the United States then? Huh. Well, let's go back and see that. top 7% for the United States. Boy, this is inconvenient. All right. Figure out how to move that. There we go. All right, percentile curve for the United States. Nice and tiny for you, but at the 7th percentile, so the 93rd percent in the US, you'd be making $151,000. And similar comparisons for other countries across Europe and the West. In fact, if you want to name some others, we can do those later in the chat. We'll try to find the second most prosperous after the US. If you want to look at the most prosperous nations in Europe, it's best to look at the oil-producing Nordics, actually, because they've got all that natural wealth. So places like Norway would have been a good answer. We all know Norway makes a lot. So in Norway, I looked this one up beforehand, Norway being the richest probably of the Baltic, or not Baltic, what am I saying? Of the Nordic countries. So Norway has a lot more gas and resources than, say, Sweden or Denmark. So you can do the same thing with them, and they're a little bit less prosperous. So in Norway, the 80th percentile is about 540,000 Norwegian kroner. And that comes out to 73,000 US dollars. Oh, sorry. That's the 90th percentile for Norway, 650,000 kroner. So a top 10% Norwegian doesn't even make what an 80th percentile American makes. This is also why you tend to see a lot of information about America's poor income mobility. When you get to the bottom quintile, so if we look at how America's broken up by wages, we see that the folks towards the median and then the folks towards the bottom, their bars are pretty close together. Let's pull this over to you. All right, so you have these bars are the median earner, and these bars are the 25th percentile earner. Those are pretty close together. It's pretty easy to get from 25th percentile to median earner. In fact, most of the 25th percentile earners could just pick up more hours. They're probably not full time. And even within like non-skilled labor careers, machine operator, waiter, etc., you can easily get to the median salary if you have experience in that field. But to try to get to the 75th percentile in the United States and above, that's rough because that starts at $75,000. You have to be quite a professional to reach that level. So most people, even in the United States, are earning closer to that median rather than the average again being skewed up. But just bear in mind that most of the world, what would be 75th percentile in America, would make you extremely rich. Top 5, top 10%. That's across most of the West, most of Europe. If you look globally, what you earn at the 75th percentile in the United States makes you unbelievably rich. That's like top 1% in places like Asia, the Middle East, etc. So those kinds of salaries are very tough to find in the rest of the world, and you guys probably all expect to make that type of salary. Another thing that I can post in the chat later is the salary for software developers in the rest of the world. These places where the 80th percentile is more like $60,000-$70,000, which is true across most of Europe, software developers make that much there. And in the United States, software developers easily make upwards of $100,000. So 80th percentile is probably near where you'll start, somewhere in the between the 50th and 80th percentile. By 10 years in the profession, remember this is for all people, not just people getting started. This is for all workers. So by the time you're 10 years in the profession, you'll be making way, way more. All right, moving along then. Wealth matters. So when we talk about software costs, we have kind of a US-centric perspective. I've seen a lot of people mention in the discussions that, well, it's like $10 or like this and that. But $10 is a lot of the disposable income of even most people in the West. Your median person in most of Europe is getting by on 30, $40,000 equivalent. So outside of the US, software also has taxes applied to it, considered generally a luxury good. In the US, you might pay 8%. In most of Europe, you'll pay 20%. In fact, most Western nations have a VAT of some sort today. America's kind of the standout in not having one. And US companies often just charge more money for their software abroad. Actually, it depends on where they are. If you look at this, this is just a random Steam game I picked and what it costs in the rest of the world and converting that back to US dollars. You can get this from SteamDB. I had to cut off part of it on both ends. So this random game, you see the US dollar in the middle is 40 bucks. In Israel, it's the most expensive. It's $52 dues. American dollar dues. In the UAE and in Saudi Arabia, it's also more expensive. Those are not necessarily places with a tremendous amount of prosperity for the whole population. We see Britain and the euro there. We just looked at them. 60 bucks is a lot of money to the median person in those nations. It only gets cheaper if you go to South America, Asia, various different places, and it's not that much cheaper. If you think of a place like the Philippines or Brazil that are on here, their average wages are way, way lower than those in the United States. So in those places, a game like this one would only be affordable to the top 10 or top 20% because a $40 disposable income purchase would be a lot of money if you're only making, say, 15, $20,000 a year. All right then. Global average income. Anybody know what it is? What is the global average income per person? This is a tough stat because to really get the global average, again, it's a dumb stat. You just take all the wealth produced in the world, all the GDP combined together, and divide it by the number of people that are alive. So that's kind of a dumb statistic. I'll give you the numbers for maybe a slightly more representative stat, but does anybody know roughly what the global average income is? Tell me in chat if you think you have a guess. Remember that there's a lot of people in Asia and a lot of people in Africa and a lot of people in South America. So just outside of the West, where the median income is pretty high, there's a lot of people making that average be an average, as averages are. Someone said 15K. Someone said posting the answer, although the answer that I see there is again one of those kind of difficult stats, right? The average per capita income. It's an interesting one. Let's see if you guys can find a more realistic number than that. What's wrong with that number? Again, well, they just took the number of people that exist and then they divided the global domestic product of the world. Well, that's not really representative. A lot of those people are elderly and children and stuff like that. So if you really get into it, it depends, but it's about $3,000 per worker. Works out to about $10,000 a household globally, two or three people working per household. Uh, then there's children and the elderly who are unable to work. Some people are always disabled in every society, unable to work due to disease or whatever. So you're looking at around $10,000 a household worldwide. If you do just that division, like we saw, you get somewhere between $10 and $12,000 in GDP per capita per person. But if you're making $3,000 a year as a worker, you're probably not going to buy $40 software. You might even think twice about $10 a month software. And again, that's the average, so about half the people are making less than that. This is skewed by the nations that are prosperous. In many places in the world, people are making about 1,000, 2,000. Places like India, where there's over a billion people and an average income of $6,000 a month, or sorry, $6,000 a year. Okay, so keep costs in perspective because small money in the USA can be big money in other places. Just something to consider as we talk about the way pricing is built. So now let's get into today's topic, which is surprise billing. You've almost certainly seen surprise billing before if you live in America and you have ever had medical services done, because when you go get medical services done in America, the cost is a mystery. It's a surprise. Woo! You get to find out later. It's like Christmas, but in reverse. Up until this year, actually, when we passed uh, a law that bans surprise billing. In theory, the price could realistically be as much as they want, assuming that you're out of network. You could be billed a very large amount of money. Now, surprise bills are limited to more specific circumstances, but the general case that you have no idea what a procedure costs until you get it and then wait a month and see what insurance paid out for it remains largely true. If you want to do an extremely tough challenge, find me the cheapest service provider to do a routine blood test like a lipid panel, let's say within 10 miles of John Carroll. So I'm willing to drive 10 miles. Find me the cheapest place to get that done. And for extra hard mode, do it now with a certain insurance plan in check, and you'll find out how impossible this is. So why is it so rare outside medical building? Well, I think we kind of understand intuitively that for you to pull off this trick, the people that you're pulling it off on have to have essentially no choice. But it's still popular in business to business transactions because businesses aren't particularly choosy and they also don't particularly care that much about seeing the cost up front as long as the cost isn't particularly high. This is basically the case in medical billing too. It's the insurance and the hospital that are haggling over the price. You're just the bystander that happens to unfortunately be responsible for whatever the result of that transaction is. But when enterprises make purchases like software, they don't really care what price it's going to be as long as it does what they want and as long as it generates enough value that it's worth it to them. Which means that if they don't like your price after the fact, you gave them a surprise bill and they're not happy with the value you're giving them, they'll probably pay you at least the one time and then they'll just stop using you. Unless, of course, they've contracted you out for something. But the long story short is that enterprise just isn't that cost sensitive up front, and they tend to be okay paying whatever it costs, in quotes, depending on what it costs is. Which brings us to the cloud. Now, we know that to start a tech company today, you need something like Lightsail. You're not going to just materialize a tech company out of the ether and host it yourself on your computers at home and do all your DNS setup and all that stuff yourself. And well, if cloud services are table stakes to get in on the game, that's going to be an interesting issue for your company since cloud services are typically charged per usage. If you have a very small piece of software, you might be able to host it on a fixed cost service like Lightsail, but those typically have some pretty hard limits. And the prices per usage are interesting. Let's look at an example of Amazon's very clear price per usage guidelines. Try to make this big for you. It's a very short document and obviously very easy to understand how your data transfer costs work for common architectures. As you can see here, this series of icons leads to a shoehorn, and then sometimes there's a phi inside of there. And if you're accessing regions, then there might be a different charge for accessing between regions. And of course, different components within your workload may incur a charge. And workload components in the same region may achieve a charge in certain circumstances, but data charges may also apply between EC2 and other platforms. You can reference this other simple price guide for more information, but as long as it looks like this, something there. And then, of course, a common pattern is to deploy workloads across multiple VPSs, and that can incur a data transfer charge for availability zones. And of course, the transit gateway interconnect can incur a charge per gigabyte on your VPS, and then workload components and different. And oh my God, it just keeps going. Okay, so very clear, very simple to understand. I guess I'm gonna put a question in chat here. I am looking at the YouTube chat, by the way. I just chose to ignore your guesses. Let's see if you've ever been surprise billed for the cloud, because all of you have had to use the cloud as part of your experience here at John Carroll. Have you ever been surprise billed for the cloud? You ever gotten the free tier and then found out, whoops, I made a mistake? That'll be 150 smackers. For those of you who voted yes, if you're willing to share, let's have a little contest. Who lost the most money? Come on, be brave, be bold. Tell us all how much they got you for, so we can do some multiplication here. I want to get an average and see how much they made. So it's about 30% of you got a surprise bill, looks like, so far. Getting some no's coming in. 130 smackers. Ouch. Let's move on while you guys pick those. Now we're going to do a game on this one later, but let's talk about usage-based pricing in the real world and how it's actually really just an illusion. Usage-based pricing is something that we like to do as societies because we think that it's fair. We think that people should pay relative to the amount of a resource they used. This is coming into some serious contention with the way people generate resources today, though. A little more on that in a bit. So let's consider electric, gas, and water. When you have electric to your home, 75% of the price of your electric bill is really just for the electricity being connected to your house in the first place. Same with water, same with gas. The actual price of generating electricity, getting the coal or whatever, burning it, turning the turbine, that's only that tiny fraction of that remaining amount. The most expensive part of getting electricity is building the power plant to have a certain capacity. So if there's 1,000 homes and you know that 1,000 homes use a peak load of a certain number of megawatts, you need to have enough power available to supply that peak load. Even though most of the time they aren't using it, the price of power generation is the price that you have to pay to build enough power plants to support the peak load. Running lines, all of that stuff, getting the power to everybody's homes, that's the main cost. All right, so is this true for cloud services? I'm not going to answer it for you. I'll let you think about it. Is it true that cloud services are billed in the same way? Is it true that most of the cost of a cloud service comes from some fixed cost that they incurred in the beginning and not actually per usage? A little bit more on gas, electric, and water. There's a limit on how much you can blow in a month. Even if you left your water running nonstop continuously, which would be pretty dumb and you deserve it at that point. So even if you decided to fill your Olympic swimming pool out of your garden hose and then just drain it out daily, you probably wouldn't go over 500 bucks, 1,000 bucks unless you actually blew your pipe out that runs to your home and just let it run all day. Same for power and gas, unless you sign a very weird agreement for power and gas. Probably a limit to how much you can use. In the cloud, you can burn $10,000 in 10 minutes completely by accident. To those of you who are willing to share how you got those surprise bills on the cloud platforms, if you can also share how long it took you to incur that charge. And keep in mind that they were just running a single thing, a single student thing, not a big package that could incur a ton more in charges. And while we're on the topic of gas and electric, let's talk about things like solar and well water. If you have solar panels on your roof, then you're supposed to get some money back, right? I mean, you're providing green energy to the grid, and that should be a discount from your bill. But remember, 75% of the charge is just to get the power to your home and to supply the peak load, which to an extent you've helped to shed, but nonetheless. Right. So what a lot of states are thinking about now is starting to bill those people who put solar panels on the roof an additional fee because they're not paying their fair share of the cost to hook up electric to their home now that they're not using as much power. Isn't that an interesting proposal? So making people who put solar on their roof pay a larger share, a larger amount per month, because they're not paying their fair share in usage fees. You see that in road usage too. As hybrids and electric cars became popular, well, roads are supported by the gas tax, which means hybrids and electric cars kind of drive on those roads for below their fair share. So now many states are imposing an additional cost on hybrids and electrics, fixed cost at the point of registration to account for the difference in tax revenue. Interesting little things that happen when you try to bill people by usage, and the usage is actually an illusion all along. I don't think I mentioned the $100,000 loss from GCP, but I've definitely heard of losses that are in that ballpark and higher. I've heard of people losing uh, a lot, tens of thousands of dollars in very, very short time intervals. And I've heard of companies, many startups that have monthly six-figure AWS bills because that's just the infrastructure that they've built, and it's a challenge then to migrate off of it. So, okay, you guys have come to this game relatively recently, so you know that some cloud providers finally have billing alerts, although this is kind of a new feature. Most of them didn't come with it. Most of them didn't come with it. Somebody said that the EU provides incentives to put solar panels. They actually still provide those incentives in the United States, but then they still want to charge you later because those incentives are separate from the fact that your utility still has to provide you a power line hookup. So it's kind of an interesting situation where sometimes you'll get a tax credit for doing something like buying an electric car or putting solar panels on your roof, but then you end up paying more in fees to account for the fact that your usage pricing has gone down. Very interesting. Not sure if Europe does the same thing, by the way. Happy to see if somebody looks that up. All right. So service alerts for when you've reached some billing point, those are a thing now, but of course, by the time that alert fires, if you're burning hundreds of dollars a second, it's possible to burn $1,000 a second on AWS easily, or maybe $1,000 a minute is easy. $1,000 a second, you have to do something pretty catastrophically dumb. By the time you get the alert, you're going to be well past that amount. Up until very recently, no provider offered a kill switch that just stops your service. I think now Azure finally has it. But up until very recently, nobody had it. Anybody want to guess as to why providers don't have a kill switch aside from massive corporate greed? The answer is actually because most of their customers don't give a crap. They just want the service to stay up no matter what. The biggest cause of getting a giant AWS bill is loads of people went to use your service at the same time and racked up a huge AWS bill. Well, if loads of people come to use your service, you don't want them to knock it out. You want that. That's the goal of your software company. So you're happy to pay whatever it costs to keep your thing afloat when the traffic peaked and the service usage peaked. And now let's talk about vendor lock, which is kind of on the other end of this, but very related. The surprise fee of vendor lock. When we talked earlier about the price of things and the price of things up front, we talked a little bit about the price to dispose of something. Well, vendor lock is the best way to depict the price of disposing of software. I think it's the best analog to disposing of software compared to disposing of something in the real world and having to pay a price for it. So here's how it works. Let's consider it. So let's say you use service A to host some widgets that are important for your company. Let's say A costs $10 a month. Let's say there's a competing service B, it's $20 a month. You go with A because it's cheaper. Every month your company sticks 1,000 widgets on A, and that's cumulative. So by the time the year is up, you've stuck 120,000 or 12,000 widgets on A. Okay, but then on month 12, A goes, look, it's $100 a month now. Take it or leave it. Can you move to B? And let's say that you're getting the same exact service at A. They haven't changed anything. You're still able to do the same exact things. They've just decided to make it more expensive. Well, of course you'd want to move to B. It's now 5 times cheaper. But can you? Maybe you can. So let's say that A charges an egress fee. We know this is common in the cloud. Once you've put your data in it, well, that part was free, and using your data while it's in the cloud, that's free too. But when you want to get your data out of the cloud, That's going to cost you. Maybe it's a penny a widget. That's 120 bucks. That's what you paid in the entire year for your subscription for A. It was $12 a month. You could have just gone with B in the first place that didn't incur this price on you and didn't have an increase. Maybe B is still 20 bucks in this situation. And also, A might not let you have your widgets back at all. Presumably, you're using A because you couldn't hold on to all your widgets yourself. Now, today, there are some laws about organizations that take your data, giving it back to you, but there's not necessarily a guarantee that A is going to give you your widgets back in a format that you can easily port over. AWS, for example, if you have enough data in their cloud services and you decide to migrate off, they can just ship you some hard drives. If you really have enough, like petabytes, they'll ship you a semi truck full of hard drives. How are you going to move your data off a semi truck full of hard drives? Well, the answer is not cheaply. All right, so maybe B, although it was cheaper, had this limitation. Like it's only you can add 2,000 widgets a month. That would have been fine for you if you'd been with B the whole time. But now it's not because you need to get all 12,000 over there. So now what can you do? Well, you can overlap your migration. So every month you generate 1,000 new widgets on A and you move 2,000 over to B. So it's going to take you about 8 months to finish the migration at that rate, which means you're going to incur 800 bucks in fees on A plus on top of what you paid on B. Or maybe B offers you to migrate all 12,000 widgets, but they're not going to offer that for free. And perhaps most importantly, you might have already built your system around A. There might be technological reasons that it's not just a instant swap. So what is the cost in developer labor, which is the most expensive item again, because developers are 80th percentile big fat earners. What's the cost of developer labor to move your system over to B? That could be a lot. Google Photos, iCloud, those are consumer-facing examples of this. You don't even need to be paying sometimes to enter vendor lock, and Google Photos offered a free tier for a long time. They stored all your precious photos for $0 a month, and they were kind enough to let you have slightly more space than most phones have memory. And then once your storage ran out, well, actually, at a certain point, I believe in 2020, Google decided there is no more free tier. If you want the photos that we had there for free, now you get to start paying us. So, a sneaky little trick getting people to get locked in and then starting to charge them, but definitely effective because most people are not technologically savvy enough to extract their photos to a hard drive or whatever. Definitely not savvy enough to keep them at the same level of access so that they can actually pull them up on their phone and show them to their grandkids and whatnot like they were doing before. So clearly a situation where a lot of customers just ended up paying. So let's look into our discussion for today. We're going to talk about surprise bills and vendor lock. Those are kind of the same thing. They're very similar, two sides of the same coin, let's say. So for this discussion, let's just assume that everybody discloses all their terms very clearly, including price increases. They handle those ethically and morally and clearly. They're great about disclosure. Nobody's getting duped. Even though that might be true, we can see that AWS, for example, they disclose all their prices just great. They just have a very convoluted mechanism for doing it. So you don't have to assume that their prices are easy to understand, but assume that they've made their best effort to disclose all the prices as best as they can. And let's even say they've done it well. They've disclosed all their prices to your satisfaction. So if you're on the moral side today, you think that companies can basically charge whatever they want, including per usage costs. Again, they've disclosed all this stuff up front to you. And then they can raise their prices whenever they want and however they want. And if you feel this way, then you think that generally companies have no obligation to help you leave them. So if Google Photos decides that it doesn't want to store your photos anymore, it might have to inform you a little bit beforehand of the price increase or whatever. But beyond that, if you don't pay or if you decide to leave, they have no obligation to make it easy for you to get all your stuff off of Photos and take it with you. And if you're on the immoral side, you think that there should be limits on this kind of uh, price raising or per usage cost, etc. You think companies are generally obligated to enable you to leave them. And of course, enabling you to leave is not free. It's something that everybody who provides a service has to develop. They now have to develop this extra thing, the thing that lets you leave. So keep that in mind if you're on this side. To what extent is that obligation required? How easy do they have to make it? How much energy do they have to expend? There might be a limit to the conditions offered then. So, for example, if A enables you to leave easily, then A should return the widgets to you in the format that you gave them to A. So it shouldn't give them to you in some proprietary format that's difficult for you to use. That's part of enabling you to leave them easily. So moral, you think they charge whatever they want, basically. Immoral, you think there are limits and they should be obligated to let you leave. And amoral, yeah, I think there should be limits, but not on all services. Some things are fair game. All right, I will see you in Discord soon.